Okay, and I think with that, we are live.
Awesome.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center's MENding check-in with Stu. I am Ryan McLean-Purdon. I'm a MENding Facilitator. And here we have Stu. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Stu Ross. I've participated in the MENding Facilitator training, and I am a high school teacher, and I am pretty passionate about this work. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad for these opportunities, and also congrats, Ryan, on this is your first facilitation of a live chat.
Woo! Thank you. Yeah, thanks for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
No worries.
I know we did our MENding session together, which is where I first met you. And I know that you taught me a lot. I learned a lot from you. So I'm really happy that we're able to continue these discussions.
Well, thanks. I'm flattered, and I learned a lot from you. I think we learned a lot from everybody in that group. It's nice to be able to sit down with other men to talk about this stuff. I think that's important, because we can talk to women, we can talk to people in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender communities about this stuff, but unless we're talking to other men about it, we gotta break out of that echo chamber, right?
Agreed. And I think with that, we decided on a topic that we were going to talk about today. And that was how the patriarchy affects men specifically.
Yeah, that's been an interesting journey for me, especially that word, patriarchy.
So what were when you first came across, that came into your world, I guess, the word patriarchy, what kind of did you think about it? Or what feelings were brought up?
Well, it's funny, like, I think it's I talked to Alicia about this on our first chat. The first time I guess it was the first time I heard the word patriarchy was kind of way back when I was, little, and it was just like you're learning about stuff in school about, a patriarchal family dynamic where the father is dominant, or a matriarchal family dynamic where the females are dominant, that kind of stuff. But I guess, and when you're that young, it's like, whatever, it's just a word that I have to learn, and it's a difficult sounding word. But I think when about 3 or 4 years ago, Trump is elected and you start seeing the hashtag smash the patriarchy on social media. And it kind of takes you back, because you think, oh my gosh, like, why is this word patriarchy so damaging? And you, I think it was harsh to hear at first, that word. It's like hearing, someone calling you hear the word racism, you hear the word homophobia, transphobia. They're hard words to hear, and there's a lot to unpack around them. So it was an interesting journey for me. Mm-hmm. Once I heard that word, and then of course MENding let me learn more about it, and the fact that it's a system and not a person, that needs to be changed. So
yeah, I guess we can kind of start with what our definitions, or what we think patriarchy is. The definition that I kind of like is a system, governance, institution, society that is built by men for men to maintain men in power, essentially.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that one. I mean, there's I've got it up on I googled patriarchy here. There's three different definitions and ways it can be used, but in each of them it basically supports what you just said there. It's a system that's dominated by men. And whether it's purposefully or passively, actively or passively at work, it pushes down women, pushes down people who don't fit the mold of what society thinks a man should be.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just it's that system that pushes people down. So, and it pushes men down too, which is the other thing. I think people don't realize, and I think it's something we hopefully get into a little bit today, is that the patriarchy sucks for men as well.
So I guess we can just go right into that.
Okay.
So, I mean, we can go all sorts of avenues here. We can make it more broad, more specific, but how are some of the ways that patriarchy directly affects men in negative ways?
I would say personally, my personal experience, once I finally understood what the patriarchy was, that it was a system and not like, well, there are a group of people who are upholding that system, whether they know it or not, but it is a system, and it's one that, it sucks for men because it forces us into that box, that man box, like we talk about in MENding, where men have to be stoic. They can only show emotion that keeps them in a position of power. They can't talk about their feelings. They have to be able to be self-sufficient no matter what. Can't ask anyone for help. That becomes pretty damaging to, like, that's damaging to anybody. I think if you think, no matter who you are, if you think you can't ask for anyone for help, you can't show any emotion, you're locked in to a space that you really don't feel safe in. Mm-hmm. And for men especially, like, any form of emotion that is seen as weak, you get ostracized, you get made fun of by your peers, you get called fag, homo, right? So then you become fearful of showing that emotion, and that leads to mental health issues, mm-hmm. poor coping mechanisms, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that later on, kind of about how not subscribing to these rigid gender roles and how other men treat one another when they don't fall into that box, like what effect that has on men. And like, you can imagine the stress that has on some people, and that ends up kind of snowballing into mental health issues.
And just like your emotional intelligence is skewed, right? Like if you're expected to be a man, the patriarchal system has this idea of what a man should be, and a man is not allowed to experience a full range of emotion, mm-hmm. or at least not outwardly show that they are. That stunts emotional intelligence, right? That stunts emotional growth. It's damaging immediately for the person and the people around them. And then, if that individual is a father or a leader of young men, they pass that sort of lesson down, and it becomes generational. So that the younger men and younger boys coming up see that, well, I'm not allowed to show my full range of emotion. I can only show these emotions. I have to keep the other ones bottled up.
And it becomes intergenerational.
Yeah, for sure.
No, but I find it interesting that to kind of maintain the patriarchy, to maintain this power, it's almost as if we're grooming men to be a certain way so that we can maintain power and dominance over other people. That's really kind of how I see it.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like we're even right now, like all the stuff in the media right now can be attached. It intersects with the patriarchy, right? Like the Black Lives Matter movement, and when people are saying, all lives matter or racism doesn't exist, there's an intersection with the patriarchy there. If people are saying that gender violence isn't as bad as we think it is, there's an intersection with the patriarchy there. And it's that whole idea of, if men don't become part of the solution and make sure that they recognize that they're part of this power dynamic. They're not outside of it. You know, it's like that, it was Jackson Katz who said that, you know, that power system is maintained by the people in power removing themselves from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just to even not like leaning into that word patriarchy, as hard as it is to do, I think that's important for people to do that learning, for men to do that learning. Put that emotional response off to the side and, you know, really look at what that word patriarchy means.
Which I think is why it's so important to cultivate an environment where we can have these discussions and kind of be open and honest with one another, and be willing to listen to others. I think so often, particularly men, just want to jump in and give their opinion or give their 2 cents, and they're not really taking in what's around them. I think people are very... everyone's in their own bubble. Everyone has their own reality and experiences. And just because you haven't been, say, the victim of a certain experience doesn't mean it's not happening to other people. So when I think of when people say things like all lives matter or that systemic racism isn't real, and you look at who in general is saying this stuff, for the majority it's white men. And not always, but...
Yeah, but I think, and I totally agree with you, I think statistically, like, stats are getting thrown around in media about everything right now. So why don't we throw some, like, or just, you know, generalizations? It is the majority. Statistically, like you said, it's white men who are saying racism doesn't exist. It's white men saying the patriarchy doesn't exist, right? Which is even a bit, even more problematic. And I think it's like, I always try to think of like what the patriarchy is for me, because I didn't grow up in a patriarchal family.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a very female dominated family. I had a dad, but he was a very sort of, you know, sit back, quiet, watch. He had his little words of wisdom, but I was very much, you know, influenced by my mother and my sister growing up. So for me, the patriarchy in my life were those sort of very covert things,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like homophobic jokes, racist jokes, that sort of thing, where it's like, oh, just joking. So that's the tougher one, I think, you know, and not realizing some of the things we did. Like you said, for a man to just want to jump into a conversation, that's part of the patriarchy right there, I think, because that's what we're told to do. Jump in, fix it, and then get out.
Dominate the conversation, be the loudest guy in the room. Yeah, certainly. No, I can definitely relate to kind of growing up in a family that maybe did things a little bit differently. I know even in regards to my last name, like I was given both my mother's last name and my dad's. Like my name's Ryan McLean Purdon. My mother, who's a teacher, went by Miss McLean as a teacher. So even, I mean, one kind of simple part of patriarchy is the man keeps his last name and the woman takes on that last name.
Yeah, the lineage is traced down through the male side.
Mm-hmm. So even in that like kind of simple example, and I didn't even really think of why my parents did that or why that happened, and it certainly wasn't a big deal to them. But I've been questioned all through my life about that. Like, why do you have 2 last names? And which is interesting because I've never really thought of like why that's a big deal.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it is. And the I think also like to go on what you're saying, why that's a big deal is like the questions that are asked of men as they go through their life versus the questions that are asked of women. And that's talking from a very binary sense of this thing. That there's a whole, like especially in MENding, when we looked at gender issues and well, the whole idea of MENding is to look at ending gender-based violence. And it's more than just men being violent with women, but I mean, like Like the questions that I get asked when I'm a teenage boy versus the questions that a teenage girl is going to get asked.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just, and it is wrong. Like a teenage boy and a teenage girl, they're both human beings. They're both teenage human beings. And they should be asked the same questions in life, right? Simple, like, what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to be when you grow up?
And they should be granted the same opportunities and be allowed to choose whatever they want to choose without being kind of ostracized or demeaned for choosing something that doesn't fit the way that society expects them to be or thinks they should be.
Yeah. Well, another interesting part of the conversation with Alicia was like we push boys into sports more than we push girls into sports.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We should just be pushing kids into sports. Like, put kids in sports, make them play outside, and then that's the end of the conversation.
I kind of have a funny anecdote about that growing up. So my mother was a gymnast, and as a kid, like, I loved watching gymnastics, like in the Olympics, like, was one of my favorite things, and really wanted to get involved in gymnastics when I was young, and like pleaded my mom and dad, like, please, like, let me do this. And there was always this hesitation. They never explicitly said, like, no, you can't do that, but it was, oh, you know what, no, let's sign you up for soccer instead.
Yeah.
And it was funny because, I mean, I didn't really get why until a little bit later, and I think it was kind of a way for my parents to protect me because they felt that, you know, gymnastics is maybe not the most manly thing to get into. Like, maybe he might be really ridiculed for that, even though my mom was a gymnast and knew there was many male gymnasts. But
those guys are strong.
Yeah.
Like, you want to talk about a male archetype? Those guys are hanging like this for how, like, give me a break. Those are some of the strongest men around are male gymnasts.
Totally.
Right? Like, just pure physical strength. And I, like, it's funny that you say, like, your parents are like, that might not be good for him. Like, there's the patriarchy in play right there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Your parents are worried about you being in an activity that doesn't fit accepted gender expectations.
And when I think of, like, how we fit into these roles or these expectations, like, we're taught this from a very, very young age. Like, I would have been like 7, 8 years old, and although I wasn't, again, told, like, you're not doing this because you're a guy and guys don't do this,
yeah,
like, that was the message that came through to me. It took me a little while to pick up on that, but yeah, I eventually did. And when I think back, it's like, oh, that's really too bad, because
yeah. So I guess maybe we kind of touched on it. I have a question for you. Like, when was your sort of first realization or experience in your life where you're like, wow, that's the patriarchy?
Good question. I mean, it wouldn't have been until later, until probably around high school, when just having kind of conversations with friends who were very, I guess, more progressive, maybe a little bit left-leaning, who really kind of brought this stuff to our attention. It would just be like funny little conversations we'd have when we'd skip school and stuff. Like, notice, like, how the majority of our teachers here are men, or the principal always seems to be, and vice principals are always men in our school. Like, why is that? Little things like that. But kind of when I think of being in the schoolyard as a kid, and every time you did something that didn't fit into that gender box, you'd be labeled gay. Like, that was just the go-to growing up. Like, oh, you want to play with dolls, or you want to, like, play dress up? That's gay. Oh, you want to play this sport that isn't hockey, soccer, football? That's gay. Like,
yeah.
And so I think when I think of my first experiences in, like experiencing that would be on the schoolyard as a kid. But first really kind of realizing and coming to terms with it, I guess, I mean, probably didn't happen until my early mid-20s, but I began some of those conversations a bit younger, maybe around 16, 17, I think. But
Well, you always had like, I'm in no way am I condoning skipping classes as a high school teacher, but you can have some of the best conversations with your friends if you just decide to take a day away from the classroom.
mm-hmm.
So, but don't skip school.
I see exactly what you're saying, and I endorse that message.
Yeah.
As someone
and I think allowing those conversations to happen organically too. Like I sometimes wonder what the control in a classroom is, something that teachers are always worried about. Number one, because we're all mostly type A. So we need to have that control. Number two, we're expected to have a classroom management plan, which is essentially, how are you going to control your students for 75 minutes? It's hard to let organic conversations happen in that kind of environment. And I'm like, I don't know, this is me rambling a bit, but it just, where can we let kids have those conversations? All right. Where are we going to let young men have those conversations so that they can, really, really start to think about, where's my place? What am I going to do with my power in society? What am I going to do with my patriarchal power to make a change?
Yeah, I think it's so important to provide those environments. And I think one thing that MENding does, kind of going into schools and having these talks with young men, I think is so important. And I know something that could have certainly benefited me to kind of have these talks at a younger age. I mean, I wish I didn't have to wait until I was 28 to start really working on this stuff. But
yeah,
I mean, I'm here now and I'm glad to be having the conversation, but 10 years ago would have been a much more, even 20 years ago would have been a much better time to start. So
yeah, I am the same. I'm 44 and I've been, the last 3 or 4 years, I've really started to lean into this stuff, and it's made a world of difference for my mental health. That's for sure. Recognizing what the patriarchy is and how it sucks for me. Sucks for everybody, obviously, because it can be a very oppressive system.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I look back on my schooling and I was like, wow, like it just, those seeds of like when we talk about in MENding, the seeds of toxic masculinity were always there. And it wasn't like I was going to guaranteed to grow up to be a toxic male. But some seeds were definitely getting planted. So.
And when I think now of like what are some of the most extreme forms that the patriarchy affects men, I think of, I was talking about this last night with some of the MENding folks while we were doing some recording for the new program, was the incel movement, and how this particular population basically feels, since they don't live up to any of the idealized versions of masculinity, that somehow that is women's fault, and then begin to target women for that very reason, and which is, I mean, absolutely sad and has ended in some awful tragedies. So patriarchy doesn't just have this kind of, I mean, it's a wide range of effects, from maybe more minute things to like absolutely like tragic incidents.
Yeah, and I think that the incel movement would be a really good example of how, if that's our definition of the patriarchy, doing bad things to men, and that's our only definition of the patriarchy, doing bad things to men, that allows a lot of other men to just remove themselves from it.
Mm-hmm.
And say, well, I'm not that, so the patriarchy doesn't influence me. right? It's like the extreme definition of racism is a premeditated hate towards people who aren't white. It's like, well, I don't have premeditated hate towards people who aren't white, so I'm not racist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these
Like,
it's
well,
like you
it's
said,
a little
so
bit
much
more
more.
than that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think we could talk about that for easily an hour or two, or many, many more. But I
Sure.
think, let's just check on time here. Yeah, I think it's probably good if we start to wrap up, just because we've now started a MENding radio show on Trent Radio every Tuesdays at 11:30. So you can hear this conversation again or other conversations with MENding facilitators. So be sure to check that out. But
What's the name of the program?
Man Cave Confidential. Yeah. So, Stu, do you have any final thoughts before we take off here?
I think one thing if there's any, I hope there are men that have tuned into this. I hope there's men that will tune in and listen. I think just there's a lot of us out here who want to make this change, and it's not easy, and it's going to be a lifelong journey. I think yesterday I saw a meme that said ally, the word ally, and if, you know, as MENding people and as men wanting to end gender-based violence and smash that patriarchy, we are trying to take on the role of ally. I saw a meme that said ally is not only a noun, it's also a verb. So it's not just something you are, but it's something you do every day, and you're going to get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be ready to get it wrong, but you're also going to get it right, and it's going to be awesome. So just keep trying.
Yeah. And I think when you're wrong, listen to the people that are telling you, and like be honest with yourself and be open to like accepting criticism, I think is so important. Yeah. But I think with that, that concludes the MENding check-in with Stu. I want to thank you so much for taking part in this. And I mean, I'm sure you'll be back for another round in the coming months.
This is like free therapy for me. This is awesome.
All right. Thanks again, Stu. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, man. See ya.
Bye.